Michael Wittmann believed in the duel. Every German tanker did. From the first day they climbed into a panzer, they were taught that armored war was decided by superiority at the point of contact. Thicker armor, longer guns, better optics. If your tank could see farther, shoot farther, and survive the first hit, the battle was already won. The Tiger I embodied that belief. Nearly 60 tons of steel, frontal armor so thick that most Allied guns simply bounced. An 88mm cannon that could kill from beyond visual recognition. In a one-on-one fight, it was almost untouchable. The Sherman, by contrast, looked like a mistake on tracks. Its armor was thin by European standards. Its main gun was modest. Its silhouette was tall. To German eyes, it was an inferior machine sent into battle against weapons it had no business facing. When Wittmann looked down at the advancing Shermans in Normandy, he didn't see a threat. He saw targets. And at first, the math seemed to confirm everything German doctrine had taught him. His Tiger destroyed them easily. One shot, one kill. Again and again. But what Wittmann didn't realize was that he was fighting the wrong war. The Americans were not trying to win tank duels. They were trying to win a campaign that stretched from Detroit to Normandy, from factory floors to muddy hedgerows. Their tank was not designed to dominate a battlefield for an afternoon. It was designed to exist everywhere, all the time, in numbers the enemy could never erase. That difference began years earlier, far from Normandy, in a quiet room in Washington, D.C. In May 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, American planners faced a problem no other nation had to solve at that scale. Any tank the United States built would have to cross oceans before it ever fired a shot. It would have to be loaded onto ships, unloaded onto hostile beaches, driven hundreds of miles on poor roads, and kept running by mechanics who might have only weeks of training. It would have to fight in deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen forests. And it would have to be produced not by the hundreds, but by the tens of thousands. German engineers optimized for battlefield excellence. British engineers built specialized vehicles for specialized roles. American engineers chose something radically different. They decided the tank did not need to be the best at anything except surviving the system that supported it. Armor was important, but it was not sacred. Firepower mattered, but only if ammunition could reach the front. Protection meant nothing if a tank couldn't be repaired, replaced, or refueled fast enough to stay in the fight. The Americans were willing to accept a tank that could be penetrated, as long as it could be moved, fixed, and returned to combat faster than the enemy could eliminate it. This was not ignorance. It was calculation. The decision that made the Sherman easy to kill didn't come from weakness, fear, or incompetence. It came from engineers doing arithmetic. When American designers laid the first blueprints on the table, they already knew how to build a heavier tank. They knew how to thicken the armor, mount a larger gun, and chase the same battlefield superiority the Germans were obsessed with. They also knew exactly what that would cost and what it would break. Every increase in armor thickness triggered a chain reaction. Thicker armor meant more weight. More weight demanded a stronger engine. A stronger engine burned more fuel. More fuel meant a larger logistics tail. A larger logistics tail meant fewer tanks could be supported at the front, and fewer tanks meant losing the one advantage America could guarantee: sustained numerical pressure. The Sherman was engineered to sit at the precise balance point where that chain reaction stopped. It weighed just enough to survive against most threats at common combat ranges, but not so much that it overwhelmed transport ships, rail cars, bridges, or recovery vehicles. It could cross the same bridges as trucks. It could be hauled by existing tank transporters. It could be loaded onto Liberty ships without redesigning ports or docks. The tank wasn't optimized for battle alone, it was optimized for movement, replacement, and endurance. The gun choice followed the same logic. American engineers could have delayed production to field a more powerful weapon earlier. Instead, they chose a gun whose ammunition could be produced endlessly, shipped anywhere, and shared across units. A tank without ammunition is just dead weight, and the Americans refused to build a machine that depended on fragile supply chains or rare components. The armor choice revealed the philosophy most clearly. The Sherman's protection was designed not to be invulnerable, but sufficient. Enough to stop common anti-tank fire at typical ranges. Enough to survive glancing hits. Enough to give the crew a chance. Beyond that point, more armor provided diminishing returns and multiplied logistical penalties. German engineers accepted those penalties because their doctrine demanded superiority at the moment of contact. American engineers rejected them because their doctrine demanded superiority tomorrow, next week, and next month. This is the part German intelligence never understood. They evaluated the Sherman as a standalone object. Americans evaluated it as one element in a vast industrial organism. A tank that could be repaired mattered more than a tank that never broke. A crew that escaped mattered more than armor that trapped them inside burning steel. A design that allowed thousands of identical machines to exist simultaneously mattered more than perfection in any single one. The Sherman was never meant to intimidate enemy tankers. It was meant to exhaust them. For every Sherman destroyed, another could arrive. For every breakdown, parts already existed. For every lost vehicle, the system absorbed the shock without slowing down. German tanks fought like champions. Shermans fought like an assembly line that never stopped moving forward. By the time Whitman realized this, it was already too late. He was fighting tanks. The Americans were fighting time, distance, and probability, and they were winning all three. The Germans believed they had proven their point. By late 1943, captured Shermans were being dragged into workshops, stripped down, measured, photographed, and judged. German technical officers compiled reports filled with criticism. The armor was too thin. The gun was inadequate. The silhouette was too tall. The gasoline engine was a fire hazard. The riveted hull created spalling. The verdict was unanimous. The Sherman was inferior. On paper, they were right. And that was the trap. German analysts were trained to evaluate weapons as isolated machines. How thick was the armor? How powerful was the gun? How far could it penetrate? How many hits could it take? Every conclusion flowed from the assumption that battlefield success came from individual superiority at the moment of contact. What they never analyzed was what happened after the hit. When a German Panther or Tiger was knocked out, the story usually ended there. If it couldn't be repaired on the spot, it was abandoned. Recovery vehicles were scarce, spare parts were often unavailable. Tanks built only months apart frequently used different transmissions, cooling systems, or final drives. Even when a tank could theoretically be fixed, the exact part might not exist anywhere near the front. A single mechanical failure could remove a vehicle from the war permanently. The Sherman operated under completely different rules. American engineers had designed it as a modular object. Major components could be swapped instead of repaired. Engines, transmissions, final drives, turrets if one failed. It didn't need precision rebuilding. It needed replacement. And replacements were everywhere. A damaged Sherman wasn't a loss. It was inventory. Recovery vehicles pulled crippled tanks off the battlefield within hours. Maintenance units stripped usable components from wrecks. 2 damaged tanks could become 1 fully operational vehicle in a single shift. Sometimes 3 broken Shermans became 2 working ones before the sun came up. The battlefield didn't clear behind American lines, it recycled. German intelligence reports never tracked this cycle. They counted destroyed tanks. They didn't count tanks returned to service. They saw flames and assumed permanence. The Americans understood something far more brutal. In modern industrial war, destruction only matters if it's irreversible. The Sherman's real protection wasn't its armor, it was the certainty that damage was temporary. Crews knew that if they survived the hit, another tank would be waiting. Mechanics knew they could fix almost anything with standardized parts. Commanders knew that losses today didn't weaken tomorrow's strength. German tankers fought knowing that a breakdown could strand them forever. American tankers fought knowing that even destruction was not the end. That psychological difference mattered as much as steel thickness. By the time the Sherman reached Normandy, in overwhelming numbers, the Germans were already losing a war they thought they were winning. They were destroying tanks efficiently and accomplishing nothing, because they were measuring success in wrecks. The Americans were measuring success in tanks still moving forward. Nowhere did the Sherman's deliberate vulnerability reveal its true purpose more clearly than in what happened after it was hit. American engineers assumed from the beginning that the Sherman would be penetrated. They did not design for invincibility. They designed for survival after failure. That single assumption reshaped everything inside the tank. The Sherman had 5 escape hatches, 2 in the turret, 2 in the hull, and 1 in the floor. They were wide, counterbalanced, and could be opened even if the tank was damaged. Interior layouts were kept clear to prevent crew members from being trapped by twisted metal or ammunition racks. Fire suppression systems were prioritized not to save the tank, but to buy seconds, just enough time for men to get out. German tanks told a different story. Tigers and Panthers were built around armor first. Thick steel consumed interior volume. Hatches were fewer and often smaller. When a penetration occurred, fire spread rapidly. Smoke filled confined spaces, and escape routes were limited. German crews frequently died inside vehicles that were theoretically better protected. Was Wittting. The result was a brutal paradox. The Sherman was easier to penetrate, but its crews survived more often. American data showed that when a Sherman was knocked out, most of the crew escaped alive. They didn't disappear from the war. They were reassigned within hours or days to replacement tanks. Experience stayed in the unit even as vehicles were destroyed. A battalion could lose dozens of tanks and still retain veteran crews. German units did not have that luxury. When a Tiger burned, the crew often burned with it. The loss was not just steel, but trained manpower, men who took years to replace and often never were. Behind the front line, the Sherman's design completed the cycle. Recovery vehicles, essentially Shermans with cranes instead of turrets, pulled disabled tanks under fire. Maintenance battalions operated like mobile factories. Engines were swapped instead of repaired. Transmissions were replaced wholesale. Turrets from destroyed hulls were mounted onto damaged but repairable chassis. A tank written off by German standards could be fighting again within a day. American mechanics didn't ask, "Can this be fixed?" They asked, "Which parts are still useful?" It wasn't. This philosophy turned the battlefield into a resource pool. Wrecks became spare parts. Damage became delay, not defeat. Losses became temporary accounting entries, not permanent reductions in strength. German commanders watching from the other side saw only the explosions. They believed they were winning because the ground was littered with burning Shermans. What they couldn't see were the recovery columns moving at night, the maintenance crews working without pause, and the replacement tanks arriving faster than their own units could be repaired. The Sherman's vulnerability wasn't a flaw. It was a feature that fed a system designed to absorb punishment without slowing down. By the time German officers began to understand this, their own armored forces were already bleeding out, not from enemy fire, but from the inability to recover, repair, and replace. They were destroying tanks. The Americans were destroying the idea that destruction mattered. Every extra inch of armor added weight. Every ton added demanded a bigger engine. Bigger engines consumed more fuel. More fuel stretched supply lines. Longer supply lines meant fewer tanks supported at the front. And fewer tanks meant losing the only advantage America intended to exploit: numbers sustained over time. So the Sherman was born not as a weapon meant to terrify enemy tankers, but as a component in a machine designed to overwhelm them. It was built to be shipped easily, repaired quickly, and standardized completely. Individual Shermans could die. The system could not. Whitman was about to discover that difference the hard way. He was winning every duel and losing the war. The Sherman leaves behind a lesson far larger than any single tank or even World War II itself. It exposes a truth about industrial conflict that many nations learned too late. Wars are not won by the most impressive machines, but by the systems that can endure loss, adapt under pressure, and continue operating when perfection fails. The first lesson of the Sherman is that war is not a contest of engineering brilliance, but a contest of systems. Germany possessed some of the most advanced mechanical engineering of the era. The Panther and Tiger were extraordinary machines when judged in isolation. but each existed inside a fragile ecosystem: unique spare parts, specialized maintenance, limited recovery assets, and long, vulnerable supply chains. When any part of that ecosystem failed, the tank's technical superiority became irrelevant. The Americans understood that a weapon is only as strong as the system that sustains it. They did not design the Sherman to be unbeatable in combat. They designed it to remain present in combat, day after day, no matter the losses. The second lesson is that attrition is inevitable. Resilience is optional. American engineers assumed the Sherman would be hit, damaged, and destroyed. Instead of fighting that reality, they designed around it. The tank, the maintenance system, the training pipeline, and the logistics network were all built to absorb damage without collapsing. Losses did not paralyze the force. They activated the system's recovery mechanisms. German armored doctrine, by contrast, treated loss as exceptional and catastrophic. Their tanks were powerful but brittle at the strategic level. Once losses accumulated, the system had no way to regenerate itself. This lesson applies far beyond armored warfare. Any organization or military that cannot tolerate losses without breaking will fail against an opponent that can. The third lesson is that people matter more than machines. The Sherman's design accepted the loss of steel to preserve human life. Escape hatches, interior layouts, and recovery procedures were all built around the assumption that the crew must survive even if the tank does not. As a result, American armored units retained experienced personnel even while losing large numbers of vehicles. Crews learned, adapted, and returned to battle with greater skill. German heavy tanks often sacrificed crew survivability to maximize armor protection. When that armor failed, entire crews were lost. Over time, Germany lost not just tanks, but irreplaceable expertise. The Americans lost vehicles and built more. Germany lost men and could not. In a long war, the side that preserves trained people will always outlast the side that preserves equipment at the expense of lives. The fourth lesson is that standardization is a strategic weapon. The Sherman was not merely a tank, it was a universal platform. The same parts, the same procedures, the same training applied across units, theaters, and years of production. A mechanic trained on one Sherman could repair almost any other. A crew reassigned to a replacement tank did not need to relearn its systems. Logistics officers did not have to manage dozens of incompatible variants. Germany followed the opposite path. Constant technical upgrades created a proliferation of versions, each with unique requirements. What improved performance on paper crippled logistics in practice. Spare parts piled up that fit nothing at the front. Tanks sat idle for lack of a single, incompatible component. The Germans improved their machines while degrading their system. The Sherman demonstrates that uniformity, not sophistication, often creates real combat power. The fifth lesson is that kill ratios do not win wars. Tank units achieved extraordinary tactical success against Shermans. On paper, their exchange ratios were impressive, but those ratios meant nothing strategically because the losses they inflicted were replaceable. Destroying a Sherman did not reduce American combat power unless destruction occurred faster than replacement. That never happened. The Americans measured success not by how many tanks were lost, but by how many were operational tomorrow. German commanders measured success by how many enemy tanks burned today. One side measured the future, the other measured the past. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in military history. Tactical brilliance can coexist with strategic failure. The sixth lesson is that the best is often the enemy of good enough. The Sherman was not the optimal tank in any single category, but it was optimal for mass production, global transport, field repair, and sustained operations. American engineers deliberately rejected perfection because perfection slowed production, increased complexity, and reduced numbers. They accepted adequacy at the vehicle level to achieve dominance at the system level. This principle applies beyond war. In technology, economics, and governance, systems that chase perfection often collapse under their own complexity. Systems that are good enough, but scalable, repairable, and adaptable tend to survive. The seventh lesson is that modern war is a battle against time. Not who fires first, not who has the thickest armor, but who can sustain operations longer. The Sherman was designed to win tomorrow's fight even after losing today's. German tanks were designed to dominate the immediate engagement, often at the cost of long-term viability. By 1944, Germany was fighting against the clock. Fuel shortages, spare part shortages, trained manpower shortages, time itself had become the enemy. The Americans, by contrast, built a system that grew stronger as time passed. The longer the war continued, the greater the imbalance became. This is why Michael Whitman's victories changed nothing. He was destroying tanks faster than almost anyone in history, yet his efforts could not slow the Allied advance. He was fighting objects, the Americans were fighting with processes. The final lesson of the Sherman is the most important. Strategic invulnerability is more powerful than tactical invincibility. Individual Shermans died daily. Entire formations did not. The tank's vulnerability at the micro level created invulnerability at the macro level. Losses were expected, planned for, and neutralized by design. The Sherman was never meant to be immortal. It was meant to be replaceable. That single idea reshaped armored warfare and continues to shape modern military doctrine. Every major post-war weapon system reflects this lesson. Modularity, maintainability, standardized training, and logistical dominance matter as much as raw combat performance. The Germans built tanks to win battles. The Americans built a system to win wars. And in industrial warfare, systems always outlive machines. The Sherman's legacy offers a second layer of lessons that are less obvious, but just as decisive. These lessons are not about steel thickness or gun caliber. They are about how power actually functions in prolonged, high-intensity conflict, and why many strong-looking forces collapse while seemingly weaker ones endure. One of the most overlooked lessons is the difference between peak performance and average performance. German tanks were optimized for peak moments. Ideal terrain, prepared positions, experienced crews, proper maintenance, and full fuel and ammunition loads. Under those conditions, they were devastating. But wars are not fought under ideal conditions most of the time. They are fought in mud, snow, darkness, exhaustion, and confusion. The Sherman was not designed to be extraordinary on its best day. It was designed to be reliable on its worst day. It performed adequately when crews were tired, when maintenance was rushed, when supply lines were stretched, and when weather was terrible. Over thousands of engagements, average performance mattered far more than peak capability. The Germans built weapons that were terrifying at their best. The Americans built weapons that were dependable at their worst. In long wars, average performance wins. Another crucial lesson is the power of predictability inside your own system. Every Sherman behaved like every other Sherman. Commanders knew what their tanks could and could not do. Mechanics knew exactly how long repairs would take. Supply officers knew precisely what parts were needed. Training instructors knew that procedures would not change from unit to unit. This predictability created confidence. Units could plan aggressively because uncertainty was reduced. Risks could be calculated because outcomes were consistent. German units, by contrast, faced constant uncertainty. A Panther might overheat. Another might suffer transmission failure. A third might require parts that did not exist at the front. Commanders hesitated because they could not trust their machines to behave consistently. Even superior weapons become liabilities when their behavior is unpredictable. The Sherman teaches that certainty is a force multiplier, not because it makes weapons stronger, but because it allows humans to use them more effectively. A further lesson lies in organizational learning. Because Shermans were standardized and crews survived at high rates, lessons learned on one battlefield spread rapidly across the force. Tactics, modifications, field improvisations, and maintenance tricks circulated quickly because they applied universally. An improvement discovered in Italy could be applied in France without redesigning the tank. German forces struggled with this. Lessons learned on one variant often did not apply to another. Improvements required factory-level changes. Feedback loops were slow, fragmented, and frequently ignored due to production pressures. The Sherman's simplicity allowed learning to compound. Each engagement made the system smarter. German complexity slowed adaptation. This leads to another critical insight. Adaptability beats optimization. The Sherman was adaptable precisely because it was not over-optimized. There was space mechanically and doctrinally for modification. New guns, new armor arrangements, improved ammunition storage, field expedient solutions, all could be implemented without breaking the system. German tanks were optimized so tightly that modification often caused cascading failures. Improvements demanded redesigns. Redesigns demanded new tools. New tools demanded factory retooling. By the time changes reached the front, the battlefield had already evolved. In fast-moving conflicts, adaptability is more valuable than perfection. Another lesson concerns psychological endurance. American tank crews fought knowing that destruction did not equal death, and death did not equal disappearance. They trusted that if they survived, they would fight again. This created a mindset that tolerated risk. Crews maneuvered aggressively because the system supported them. German crews fought under constant pressure that every mistake might be final. Mechanical failure could mean abandonment. Penetration often meant death. Replacement crews were scarce. This produced caution, fatigue, and eventually fatalism. Even elite units began to conserve themselves not because they lacked courage, but because the system offered no margin for recovery. The Sherman demonstrates that morale is not only a product of leadership or ideology. It is a product of logistics, recovery, and replacement. Soldiers fight differently when they know the system behind them will not abandon them. The Sherman also teaches a lesson about economic realism. German armored programs consumed disproportionate resources, special steels, specialized machining, unique components while delivering limited operational availability. These tanks competed with aircraft, submarines, and artillery for scarce industrial capacity. Every Tiger represented resources that could not be used elsewhere. The Sherman, by contrast, was economically efficient at the system level. It used commercial engines, common steel, simplified manufacturing, and distributed production. It did not starve other branches of the military. America could build Shermans while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, and trucks at unmatched scale. The lesson is clear. A weapon that consumes the economy weakens the nation that builds it. Sustainable power requires sustainable industry. Another rarely discussed lesson is the value of redundancy. The American system accepted duplication as strength. Factories produced the same tank, multiple supply routes fed the same units, multiple maintenance levels overlapped. This redundancy made the system resilient to disruption. Bombing one factory did not halt production. Losing one depot did not collapse logistics. German production was centralized, specialized, and fragile. When key facilities were bombed, entire production lines halted. When rail lines were cut, supplies stopped. Efficiency without redundancy created vulnerability. The Sherman proves that redundancy is not wasteful in war, it is insurance. There is also a profound lesson about time horizons. German design philosophy focused on winning the next engagement. American design philosophy focused on winning the next year. Decisions that look inefficient or suboptimal in the short term often prove decisive over time. The Sherman's perceived weaknesses mattered less with every passing month because the system amplified its strengths. This is why American power increased as the war continued, while German power peaked early and declined rapidly. The Sherman was designed for the long haul. German tanks were designed for decisive moments that never truly arrived. Finally, the Sherman teaches a lesson about humility in design. American engineers did not assume they could predict every battlefield condition. They assumed they would be wrong. Therefore, they designed flexibility, repairability, and scalability into the system. German engineers assumed they could design the perfect solution and were punished when reality refused to cooperate. Humility allowed the Americans to build a system that corrected itself. Arrogance trapped the Germans inside their own brilliance. Taken together, these lessons explain why the Sherman remains one of the most important weapons in military history, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it enabled. It enabled continuity. It enabled learning. It enabled survival. It enabled pressure without collapse. The Sherman teaches us that victory in modern war belongs not to the strongest blow, but to the force that can keep striking long after others have exhausted themselves. Machines break, systems endure, and in the end, endurance decides everything. The Sherman forces us to confront a truth that feels uncomfortable precisely because it contradicts instinct. Strength at the point of impact is not the same as strength over time. Humans are wired to admire the decisive blow, the heavier armor, the bigger gun, the superior machine. But industrial war does not reward brilliance in moments. It rewards survivability across months, seasons, and years. German armored doctrine was built around decisive encounters. Their tanks were designed to dominate a fight so completely that the enemy would collapse. This mindset assumed wars were resolved by critical engagements. The Sherman was built on the opposite assumption. There would be no decisive moment, only continuous pressure. If there is no single battle that ends the war, then the weapon that matters is the one that keeps coming back. This is the core misunderstanding that doomed German armor. A tiger that destroys 5 Shermans feels like power. But if that tiger cannot be repaired, refueled, or replaced, its power exists only in memory. A Sherman that dies but is replaced within 24 hours creates power that compounds. Over time, compounding power crushes isolated excellence. The Sherman teaches that continuity beats dominance. Another hard lesson is this: failure is not a flaw if it is planned for. American engineers assumed tanks would fail. They assumed crews would make mistakes. They assumed machines would be hit, damaged, and destroyed. Instead of denying those realities, they engineered around them. The Sherman was not fragile, it was forgiving. Forgiving of mistakes, forgiving of wear, forgiving of damage. German tanks were unforgiving. A minor mechanical fault could immobilize them. A damaged transmission could end a tank's life without enemy action. A single penetration could annihilate the crew. These tanks demanded perfection from machines, from logistics, from crews. War does not provide perfection. It punishes those who demand it. The Sherman shows that systems that tolerate error outlast systems that require excellence. This tolerance for failure reshaped behavior on the battlefield. American crews maneuvered aggressively, not because they were fearless, but because they trusted the system behind them. They knew that being knocked out was not the end. Survival meant return. Return meant experience accumulated rather than erased. German crews knew the opposite. Each engagement carried existential risk. Loss of the tank often meant loss of life, or at best, removal from combat with no replacement. Over time, this knowledge changes how people fight. Caution replaces aggression. Preservation replaces initiative. Even the best weapons cannot compensate for a mindset shaped by scarcity and irreversibility. The Sherman proves that logistics shape psychology as much as ideology. Another brutal lesson is that visibility of loss distorts judgment. German commanders saw burning Shermans everywhere. The battlefield looked like proof of victory, but they were witnessing only the visible side of the equation. What they could not see were the flows behind the front. Repair columns, spare parts depots, replacement crews, ships unloading new tanks by the hundreds. The Americans understood something essential. If the enemy is counting your losses, let them. As long as those losses do not degrade your future capacity, they are strategically irrelevant. The Sherman weaponized this illusion. It allowed the enemy to believe they were succeeding, while the system quietly prepared the next wave. This is why German intelligence consistently misread American strength. They analyzed wrecks, not replenishment rates. They measured destruction, not regeneration. They mistook noise for effect. The Sherman teaches that what matters in war is not what is destroyed, but what remains functional. There is also a lesson about speed of recovery versus speed of destruction. Many people assume victory comes from increasing lethality. The Sherman shows that increasing recovery speed can be more decisive. If you can repair faster than the enemy can destroy, you achieve a form of invulnerability that armor alone can never provide. German tanks focused on avoiding destruction. American tanks focused on minimizing downtime. One philosophy tries to prevent loss. The other renders loss meaningless. In long conflicts, the second philosophy always wins. The Sherman also exposes the danger of complexity masquerading as sophistication. German tanks were technologically advanced, but that advancement came at the cost of fragility. Each improvement introduced new dependencies, new materials, new tolerances, new training demands. Each layer of complexity narrowed the margin for error. The Sherman was technologically simpler, but strategically smarter. Simplicity allowed mass production. It allowed distributed manufacturing. It allowed field improvisation. It allowed adaptation under pressure. Complexity locked German armor into a brittle state where any disruption, bombing, fuel shortage, loss of specialists caused cascading failure. The lesson is harsh but clear. Complex systems fail catastrophically. Simple systems fail gracefully. Another critical lesson lies in how time amplifies design choices. Early in the war, German tanks appeared dominant. Late in the war, they became liabilities. Early weaknesses in the Sherman mattered less with each passing month. Every week of continued fighting favored the system built for endurance. This is why American power increased over time, while German power decayed even before accounting for air superiority or strategic bombing. The Sherman was a time machine. The longer the war lasted, the stronger it became relative to its opponent. German armor, by contrast, was a wasting asset. Each month reduced availability, spare parts, trained crews, and operational readiness. What looked superior at first became unsustainable. The Sherman teaches that time is a weapon, and some systems are designed to wield it. There's also a lesson about moral realism. The decision to accept vehicle losses in order to reduce total casualties was not emotionally comfortable. It required leaders to think beyond individual tragedies toward aggregate outcomes. Making the Sherman heavier might have saved some crews in specific encounters, but it would have lengthened the war, reduced overall tank availability, and increased total casualties across all forces. One of the hardest truths in military decision-making. Sometimes saving more lives requires accepting visible losses now to prevent invisible losses later. The Sherman embodies this cruel arithmetic. Finally, the Sherman teaches us that winning wars requires humility. American engineers did not assume they could predict the perfect battlefield conditions. They assumed uncertainty. They assumed friction. They assumed chaos. And they designed a system that could function anyway. German engineers assumed mastery. They assumed control. They assumed that superior machines could impose order on chaos. Chaos proved otherwise. The Sherman was not a masterpiece of engineering elegance. It was a masterpiece of strategic humility. It accepted that things would go wrong and made that acceptance its greatest strength. In the end, the Sherman was not powerful because it was hard to kill. It was powerful because killing it did not matter. That is the most dangerous weapon of all. The Sherman ultimately teaches a lesson that goes beyond tanks, beyond armies, and even beyond war itself. Systems win not by avoiding damage, but by making damage irrelevant. This is the final inversion that German doctrine never fully grasped, and by the time it did, the war was already lost. German planners believed the purpose of design was to prevent failure. American planners believed the purpose of design was to survive it. That difference shaped everything. A Tiger was engineered like a fortress. It demanded precision fuel, specialized parts, expert crews, and ideal conditions. When everything aligned, it was terrifying. But when anything failed, fuel shortages, mechanical wear, air attack, terrain, it collapsed inward. The Tiger did not degrade gracefully. It went from dominant to useless in a single step. The Sherman degraded smoothly. A damaged Sherman might lose speed, firepower, or armor integrity, but it could still move, still fight, or at least still be recovered. Even when it was completely disabled, its value did not disappear. It became parts. It became training. It became experience, preserved in living crews. It remained inside the system instead of falling out of it. This is the difference between brittle power and elastic power. Brittle power looks overwhelming until the moment it snaps. Elastic power bends, absorbs shock, and returns again and again. The Sherman was elastic by design. Another brutal lesson is that visibility of sacrifice can be misleading. Burning Shermans were visible, dramatic, and emotionally powerful. They reinforced the myth that American armor was being slaughtered. German crews believed they were inflicting decisive losses because the evidence was right in front of them. But sustainability is mostly invisible. You do not see spare parts warehouses. You do not see replacement crews rotating forward. You do not see maintenance shifts working through the night. You do not see ships unloading tanks while wrecks still smoke at the front. The Americans operated in this invisible space where wars are actually decided. The Sherman exploited this asymmetry of perception. It allowed the enemy to believe they were succeeding while the strategic balance quietly tilted further out of reach. This is one of the most dangerous advantages a system can have. It hides its true strength until it is too late to counter it. The Germans believed they were winning because they were destroying what they could see. The Americans were winning because they were preserving what could not be seen. Another lesson lies in how replacement changes the meaning of courage. German tank crews were often individually brave, to the point of recklessness, because they knew survival odds were poor regardless. American crews were brave in a different way. They took risks, knowing that survival meant continuity. That courage compounds over time. When soldiers believe survival leads back into the fight, they invest emotionally in learning, adapting, and improving. When survival feels accidental or meaningless, combat becomes a final act rather than part of a process. The Sherman enabled courage that accumulated instead of courage that burned out. This distinction matters. The Sherman also reveals a lesson about organizational honesty. American planners did not lie to themselves about the battlefield. They did not pretend tanks would be invulnerable. They did not assume training would eliminate mistakes. They did not assume logistics would function perfectly. They planned for failure as a baseline condition. German planning was often aspirational. Tanks were designed for ideal usage rather than realistic usage. When reality diverged from expectation, the system had no buffer. The Sherman's buffers, extra parts, redundant production, overlapping maintenance levels absorbed reality instead of being crushed by it. This is why overconfidence is more dangerous than underperformance. The Sherman accepted mediocrity in isolated metrics to avoid catastrophic surprise. There is also a lesson about how war punishes specialization. German armor specialized in tank versus tank combat. The Sherman was designed to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, operate across terrain, and function inside combined arms warfare. It was not the best at any one task, but it was compatible with everything. This compatibility mattered more than raw performance. Shermans worked with artillery, infantry, engineers, aircraft, logistics units, and naval forces seamlessly. German heavy tanks often dictated the pace of operations around themselves. When they could not move, the entire formation stalled. The Sherman teaches that integration beats specialization in large-scale conflict. Another critical insight is how replacement reshapes attrition math. Attrition is not simply about losses, it is about net losses. A force that replaces 80% of its losses faster than the enemy can inflict them will grow stronger even while bleeding. This feels counterintuitive, but it is mathematically brutal. The Sherman was built to dominate net attrition. Even when losing tanks daily, American armored strength increased. German armored strength decreased, even on days when they won tactically. This is why battlefield impressions diverge so sharply from strategic outcomes. The lesson here is cold. Attrition favors the side that treats loss as a logistical problem rather than a moral crisis. There is also a lesson about learning speed. Because Shermans were standardized and ubiquitous, improvements spread rapidly. Field modifications could be adopted across thousands of vehicles. Tactics evolved quickly because equipment behavior was predictable. German forces learned slowly because every solution was specific. A fix for one variant might not apply to another. Training lagged behind equipment changes. Lessons arrived too late to matter. In modern terms, the Sherman had a fast update cycle. German armor had a slow one. In competitive environments, speed of learning often matters more than initial advantage. The Sherman's philosophy also exposes the danger of hero-centered warfare. German doctrine elevated aces elite tank commanders, whose personal skill became symbolic. Michael Wittmann was one of them. His achievements were extraordinary, but hero-based warfare does not scale. The American system did not depend on heroes, it depended on processes. Any crew could be replaced. Any tank could be repaired. Skill was distributed, not concentrated. When heroes died, the system did not weaken. This is why Wittmann's death changed nothing, and why German morale suffered disproportionately from the loss of elite individuals. The final, deepest lesson of the Sherman is this: wars are not won by denying death. They are won by controlling it. The Americans did not pretend death would not happen. They structured their system so that death of machines, not people, was absorbed, redirected, and neutralized. German planners attempted to build machines that resisted death entirely. When those machines failed, death consumed everything around them. The Sherman accepted mortality at the vehicle level to achieve immortality at the system level. That is why it remains one of the most dangerous weapons ever built, not because it was hard to destroy, but because destroying it did not matter. Steel burned. Crews lived. The system advanced.